Welcome to this lecture where I'm going to teach you the foundation of creating PowerPoint slides. Later on, I'll show you the difference between what I would call mushy chocolate cake slides and elegant chocolate cake slides. So if you're going to get started with PowerPoint slides, there are 5 things that you need to bear in mind. Number 1 is the template. Number 2 is the technology. 3 is how you tailor your slides. 4 is how you teach the content using slides. And number 5 is a thought that you are leaving your audience with. Let's start with the template. Now, with PowerPoint slides, there's a lot of templates that come standard with PowerPoint. And what I'm going to ask you is, very simply, whatever template you use, ideally choose one with a light background. Something in white or a creamish background, something not as dominating as a color as, say, black. There are some that would prefer a black background, but personally, I find it too dominating as a color. When you have a white background, it's easy to overlay color on top of that in the form of pictures or text boxes. Number 2, when you're choosing a slide, choose one without that dominating frames that take up the space on the bottom left-hand corner or the right-hand corner. It takes up space for your actual content. And number 3, keep your slides template consistent. Now let's look at how to tailor the slides. With that, I would like to introduce a concept that is known as working memory. When you are presenting to your audience, remember that they are listening to you with a very short-term memory. And as a consequence, you can't overwhelm them with too much of information. You give them too much of information, and eventually they will not listen to you. There is something that's known as the redundancy effect, which says that 1 + 1 equals to 0. So if the first 1 equals to you speaking to your audience, the second 1 equals to what you're putting on your PowerPoint slide. Now let's assume that you are speaking and you have a very busy PowerPoint slide. What the audience actually takes in is 0. So you have 2 options. Either as a speaker, you can put up a very busy PowerPoint slide and then you don't say anything for a few seconds, which is not very practical because you're allowing your audience to read your very busy slide. Or, better, as a speaker, you put up a very simple PowerPoint slide, which your audience quickly digests, and then as a speaker, you speak on top of that slide. And that allows you to overcome this redundancy effect. Next, when you're putting your slides together, remember that size does matter. As an audience, when the audience listens to you and opens their eyes to look at you, they see 4 things. Number 1 is the moving objects. It's you moving on the stage, it's you using your hand gestures. And for that, I'd ask you to go to the earlier sections on this course, on the content that I'd covered on how to move on the stage and how to incorporate body language. Because as a speaker, when you're putting up a slide, you don't want to be moving excessively and you don't want to be using your hand gestures excessively because it creates this distraction on top of a busy slide. Number 2 is what is known as signaling objects, and this refers simply to the colors, red, orange, and yellow. These colors attract attention, and you, as a speaker, firstly, you don't want to be using these colors on your clothing because it's very dominating, and so it tends to overwhelm your audiences. What I would suggest though is to use the colors red, orange, and yellow on your PowerPoint slide. So put a red arrow or a yellow marker or perhaps an orange frame to highlight content within your PowerPoint slide. Number 3 is what is known as contrasting objects, and it's basically how one item on your slide contrasts against the other. So you want to have a flair for color and pick out anything that's too dominating. Like black on gray is too dominating, green on red is a dominating color. You want to choose colors that's not clashing with each other but actually complements the content of what you're showing. And number 4 is big objects. So if you look at the screen, I have the same content on this slide and the same information. All I've done here is change the size of the font on the title font to be slightly smaller than the body font. So in the first slide, your eyes go to the title bar, and on the second slide, your eyes go to the body of the slide. Now, what is the lesson here? The suggestion is to make the font of the body text slightly bigger than the font of the title, because the body font is where the bulk of your information is and where you would like to draw your audience's attention to. Finally, with this, you want to pay attention to color, font, and layout. If you have followed this course so far, I would have shown you how to construct your speech by constructing a good story. Your PowerPoint slides need to follow that story framework. Number 2, the font and the size of the font. Now, you don't need to keep the font and the size of the font to be the same for every single slide. It just depends on what each slide is about. Because when I put my own PowerPoint slides together, there are some slides that I'd like to just change the font slightly to make a bit more of an impact, or change the color a bit. So you don't necessarily have to have the same font right throughout. Yes, it does help for consistency, but if one or two items on that slide you just like to emphasize a little bit more, then by all means, change the color and change the font. At the end of the day, the content needs to share a message and be impactful and emphasize items on your slide. Number 3, the color contrast. If you look at the slide, each one of those text boxes are in a shade of orange. But by changing the shading slightly, it adds a bit of emphasis to it and creates what we have learned earlier, which is that color contrast, versus having every item in the same shade of orange. Picture versus layout. So as you can see, I've aligned this, I've tilted the angle of the text boxes slightly so that it aligns with the content. The title bar is there for a reason. Don't just create boring, mundane titles. Create excitement and enthusiasm so that before you actually show the body of the content, it has a bit of an abstract content versus saying pictures. Instead you say, find your passion. You'll see that in a later slide of mine. And vary your color scheme. So if you've been following my own PowerPoint slides, you will see that the color of the font and the color of the text boxes changes in alignment with the picture that I have in the background. So in this particular one, I've got like a light blue background, and so an orange text box contrasts very nicely with that particular picture. When you're incorporating pictures into your slide, choose simple pictures and not confusing pictures. So if I have to talk to you about branding yourself, say, I could have this picture. But I'm sure you are looking at this picture now, wondering how this picture is talking about personal brand. Because it's so complex, it has so much of content in there. Versus having a picture like this, where I'm talking about personal branding. You look at the picture, you quickly gauge the information, and now the audience's eyes are back to you. And that's essentially how you want to choose pictures. Simple pictures that illustrate the message quickly, and so your audience's eyes are focused back on you. Let's move on to teaching the content. Remember, with PowerPoint slides, you're not doing anything that's different towards what I have taught you already. The slides is not the teacher, you are. The slides is not the presenter, you are. The slides is not leading the audience's content, you are. All the slide is doing is complementing your talk. Now let's look at the 4th T in my framework, which stands for technology. I want you to look at the following slide, and I want you to count how many dots there are on the screen. Let's go. How long did that take you? 10 seconds? Perhaps 6? Let's try the next slide. Count how many dots there are on the screen. Was it a bit more quicker this time? Perhaps you were able to count the number of dots in under 5 seconds. Let's try the 3rd slide. count the number of dots that are on the screen. I'm sure that was almost instantaneous. Now there's a principle behind this exercise which is called the 5 by 5 rule. With the third slide, there's only 5 dots in there. And that tells me to tell you that as a presenter, you want to follow what is called the 5 by 5 rule. Having a maximum of 5 objects on your slide, which could be 5 bullet points, or 1 line at a time, but a maximum of 5 words per line, or a maximum of 5 pictures on your slide at any point in time. I'll show you later on in this section how to use animation to build up the slide if ultimately you're going to have more than 5 objects on your slide. So follow the 5 by 5 rule. By doing so, your audience looks at the slide, they get the information quickly, and their attention is back to you as a speaker. If you don't have a clicker yet, and your PowerPoint is in PowerPoint mode, if you want to try this now with your own PowerPoint, by clicking B, just the letter B, once it's on PowerPoint mode, it blacks out the screen. You press B again, it brings it back into PowerPoint mode. If you just press W, it whites out the screen, and if you press W again, it brings it back into PowerPoint mode. Why is that interesting to know? Because as a presenter, if at some point in your presentation someone has to ask you a question, you don't want to have the slide showing in the background. So by pressing B or W, it either blacks out the screen or whites out the screen, so that the eyes are not focused on something that's not related to what they're asking. And so you can then take control of that audience's attention by them looking at you only. When to use a blackout and when to use a whiteout, it depends on how the projector is set up. If the projector is sort of low down, by whiting out the screen, it can sometimes show your own shadow on the projector screen. If that's the case, I would suggest that you use a blackout screen. And if you are in a big conference venue and you're talking to a group of people, the technicians at the back would generally prefer that you white out the screen, otherwise they're going to feel that when you black out the screen that something has happened with your presentation. Unless you tell them in advance that you are controlling it and you will be blacking it out with your clicker at some point during a presentation. And there you have it, that's the first 4. Now I'll take you through the final T in creating impactful PowerPoint slides, which stands for thought. That concludes this lecture. We have shared with you how to create the foundation of your PowerPoint slides. In the next lecture, I've dedicated that entire section of showing you how to make your PowerPoint slides pretty and impactful. So I'd suggest that you have your own laptop open with PowerPoint, and as I take you through those different techniques to learn it and entrench the learning quickly and play around with PowerPoint yourself. Join me on that next lecture and I'll share with you how to create those impactful slides.